Good evening, everyone. Welcome to St. Columba's. Tonight's forum is one of our special presentations that we're having for our 150th anniversary. We're going to have lots of celebrations of that over the next 12 months or so, so it's great to have you all here for that. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. In a little bit, towards the end of the talk, People books from Tacoma Park, DC are going to be here for our guests' book. So we'll be selling those books in the back. That's where you'll be able to find our guest tonight, and he'll be there to sign books. So please, if you're interested in getting the book and helping out a local bookseller, there's that. Let's start with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you for a time to gather tonight to think and reflect and meditate on those very hard things to name in our church body. Forces of power that are using our holy words for their own interests. And politics, and our friends, and our family, and everything that is swirling in the news, and for a chance to welcome Dr. Jones as a guest, and to have a hard, honest conversation about all of it. We pray that you open our eyes to your kingdom, ever present, ever hidden, that you fill our souls with a passion and earnestness for justice and truth. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Ray Suarez.
Well, I've been enlisted to introduce Robert Jones, and it is a kick to welcome him here to St. Columba's, to my church home, because I've been an admirer of his work for many years. Robert Jones is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, which is a treasure trove, a valuable resource. Visit their website, prri.org. It's tremendous. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Jones writes regularly on politics, culture, and religion for The Atlantic, Time, Religion News Service, and other places. He's frequently featured on major national media like CNN and MSNBC and NPR and the New York Times, and on and on. He is also the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award, and the author of The End of White Christian America, which is a terrific book. And even though now it's 5 years old, shockingly, you definitely, it's as current as today's newspaper. It won the Grawemeyer Award in Religion. He writes a newsletter at whitetolong.net, which you should search out, and writes weekly on his own Substack, robertpjones.substack.com. I don't know, how many of you have read Substacks? They're the new columnists, the new world, in a post-newspaper world. We're not going to have Walter Lippmann's anymore. We're going to have Robert Jones on Substack. And he describes that newsletter as dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. He has a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Please welcome Robert Jones.
Thanks so much. I've got it. Yep. Thank you. Well, I'm so thrilled to be with you today. Thank you for having me. This is like my favorite venue. I love to talk in churches, and I particularly love to talk in churches that I know are already doing the work. Reverend Daniels shared with me some work that you all have already been doing about your own history, trying to think through what does it mean and how has white supremacy sort of crept in, influenced, and shaped the history of the church, the denomination, the theology, etc. And that's really the heart of the work that I've been up to, really over the last 3 books that Ray pointed to here. This book, I'll kind of put it in context in a minute, but I'm going to start with a story. I tell a lot of stories in this book. I'm a sociologist by training, but this one's got a little more history and a little more narrative context to it. So I'm going to start with the story because I think it gets to the heart of what I'm kind of up to and the kinds of lenses that I think we're going to need to have to really move the country forward productively. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade raft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin making plans to escape north. The Hickman party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd. But because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children aboard, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight, but also knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesota with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as his final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee in Lower Town on the outskirts of St. Paul. As local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competition for jobs. As word spread, a crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that St. Paul police arrived on the scene, but after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with his trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th, but they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people who had been held under armed guard all winter following the Dakota War of the year before in a miserable encampment in a lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation downriver from their ancestral homes to a bleak reservation in the Nebraska Territory. By the time the ice finally melted and the river levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo, 547 Dakota people, who he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner like so many cattle, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from man. Neither Hickman nor his companions nor the Dakota people would have had the perspective to realize that they were witnessing the momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and Indian removal in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River, that the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware that in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. So this encounter on May 5th, 1863 contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect the westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi to Missouri and the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters and stories of indigenous people populating this land for millennia? Or do we portage east and cross the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning. So I kicked this story off, as I was driving here, many of you may have heard the story on NPR this afternoon about Alabama, right? And Alabama is the governor's just signed one of these don't talk about slavery, don't talk about the past, kind of so-called critical race theory bills. Copycat bills like this all over the country still being considered, but Kay Ivey just signed this into law in Alabama. So we're very much in the middle of this roiling debate over how we got to be who we are and where we are in this country. In my day job at PRI, as Ray said, I do a lot of public opinion survey data. That's primarily what we do, demographic tracking and survey data. But we realized around 2015, 2016, that the biggest debates in the country were no longer over specific issues. They were over the much bigger questions about identity. In fact, there was a kind of identity crisis that the country was having. And so the questions that were really dividing the two political parties in the country were, less about a specific policy, but they were more about who is truly an American? Who counts as a real American? What does it mean to be an American? These were the big divides. And so that goes straight, right? So the battle lines came less about policy, and then it goes straight to history, right? And so that's where the big battle lines are being fought. And I guess what I'm trying to hold together in this book are kind of these two stories that often get told when they get the indigenous story, when it gets told at all, is often over here. The story about African Americans is over here, and then often the story about Europeans is over there. And I'm trying to kind of hold these things together to help us tell a more coherent story about how we got to where we are, and how these things are actually woven together. And what we see is this kind of European interactions with both Africans and people here in this country, really fueled by this idea of the superiority, right, of European civilization to everything else on the planet, right? That's the kind of thing that's driving it. What's often missed, though, and what I mean by the hidden roots of white supremacy, is that the thing that really gets that audacious claim off the ground and roots it and justifies it is Christian theology, right? And so unpacking that piece is kind of what I'm really trying to hang on to here, and particularly for talking to audiences like this. And I grew up, as you may have picked up from the seminary degree, I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi. All right, so that's kind of my background and roots. And I thought I'd tell you just a little bit about me and then kind of jump back to the book. But one of the things that kind of set me on this journey was I think, the kind of unsettled contradictions of my growing up. So just like a few of them. So I remember, I was born in 1968, and Jackson Public Schools did not get around to integrating our public school system until 1976. Right? So that's 22 years after Brown v. Board of Education. And so that means that I remember that happening, right? I was in third grade in Jackson Public Schools when we first got our first black teachers, our first black classmates, and there was there were no protests, there wasn't that kind of thing going on, but there was an absolute conspiracy of silence among white adults in our lives. Like, nobody told us what was happening, because of course to tell us what was happening would have to tell us why it's happening, right? And to begin to tell that story, and nobody wanted to talk about that. But it meant that there was just this weird thing going on, right? I went to a public high school, fully integrated, about half black, half white in Jackson, Mississippi. Our mascot was the Rebels, right? We modeled ourselves after the University of Mississippi. Confederate flags flew at the football games. The band played Dixie when we scored touchdowns there. And this was, again, at a kind of fully integrated school. When I went to college, I went to a good Baptist college right outside of Jackson, Mississippi. Our mascot was the Choctaws, right? And we would chant, as the Kansas City Chiefs still do, right? This kind of tomahawk thing at the games. We would chant, "Scalp 'em, Choctaws, scalp 'em," those kinds of things. All at our good little Baptist, college right here. And so I think those things, like when I was fully in it, didn't register to me, right? They really didn't. But as I got away from them, they began to feel like more and more unsettled in me. And so I think it's been a really long journey for me to kind of start unpacking these things. And I think what really is at stake for me is that, if we really don't understand how deeply white supremacy has infiltrated and really embedded itself in white Christianity in this country, both our country and our churches are in trouble, right, if we can't sort this out, because it has distorted the best of both of them in very deep ways. So really, the last three books have all been about, in various ways, trying to sort this out. Two objects in my life, though, I think will also give, I know you've all been doing your own history, but I've done some genealogical research in my side, and there's two objects that I think of that kind of characterize this dichotomy as well. When I went to seminary, my mother gave me the old family Bible as kind of a symbolic gift on my way out to seminary. It had been passed down from generation to generation since 1815 up to the present, right? So 200 years now, this Bible's been in our family, and many of you may have one of these. In between the Old and New Testament are these genealogical pages, and it records births, deaths, marriages. And there's about 4 generations of my mother's side of the family recorded in there. And so there's nothing else like that. That's the oldest object, right, that our family has preserved, was this religious document and this deep, deep connection to Christian faith and Scripture. And so it's then the thing's been taken care of. So I had that, and I've always known that was a highly prized object on my mother's side of the family. Plenty of Baptist preachers, along that line in and around Middle Georgia, and deep roots there to the early 1800s. But it wasn't until I started doing genealogical research that another part of that story appeared, right? And many of you probably know, at least partially, where this is going. I found, through the wonders of digitized things on Ancestry.com, an estate settlement of the namesake of that Bible. His name was Pleasant Moon. He is my 6th great-grandfather back in Twiggs County, Georgia. And on that estate settlement, it lists out everything that's in the household, like six chairs, 1 table, 1 feather bed, 1 bay mare, 6 head of sheep, bales of cotton, like all of that is all listed out. And then among all those things are 4 human beings. And they're named, like a woman, Naomi, at $400. Sarah, a girl, at $150. Bird, a boy, at $150. And then it just goes on and lists other things there. And when I looked at that, my family was not the Gone with the Wind, right, rich plantation. That's not who we were. In fact, if you add up all of their earthly goods and convert to today's dollars, it only added up to about $50,000, right, of today's money. Like that's kind of, so we'd call them like, kind of maybe aspiring middle class, working class, subsistence level farm. It was less than 200 acres there. And those human beings were 70% of the assets, right? That's how the economy worked, even for people at that level there. And so, for me, I think, again, one thing that like really set me on this journey was that I had these two objects from the same family sitting side by side on my desk, right? One about faith and kind of pride and family history and how much faith was a central part of who we were all the way back then. And then the sense that enslaving other people on the basis of the color of their skin was seen to be completely compatible with that faith that we so valued, right? And then, of course, you could run the history all the way up, segregated churches opposed to civil rights, like all of that stuff, all the way up through the 20th century. So I think for me, it's really been about knowing that if the faith, sort of my own faith, didn't kind of exorcise, right, that the white supremacy so deeply embedded in it, it wasn't something I could hang on to. And also, the way that faith has really justified white supremacy in the larger society is something that we had not really dealt with very well. So I began these last three books. I'll kind of run through because I think it sets the table for this one, and I'll dive in just to the heart of this one, make sure we leave some time for some discussion. But so the book I wrote in 2016 that Ray references called The End of White Christian America. And there I was really trying to sort out, like, what's going on, what I sometimes like only half jokingly called like the great white Christian freakout that we've been seeing right in this country over the last 5 to 6 years. Like what's happening there? And so I was trying to trace, look at, and one of the things that I think is happening that's key is that two things happened, say between 2008 and 2016. So one, we had our first African American president, right? That's what happened there. But here's the other thing that happened, I think, that got missed by many. We went from being a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a majority white Christian country during that same period. Right? So even if people couldn't read the statistics or all that and didn't know the stats, people could feel it, right? People feel the radio stations changing, right, around them, the grocery store shelves changing, the photos of the elementary school classes and the demographics of those classes changing, their neighborhoods shifting. People sort of could feel that sort of thing. But just to give you the numbers, like if you go back to 2008, as recently as when Barack Obama was running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. So if you take every sort of white non-Hispanic person who identifies as any kind of Christian, it's majority, 54%. By the time we get to 2017, that number had dropped to 47%. That number today is 42%. Right, so it's just been this kind of slide, and there's no group that has dropped more than white evangelical Protestants over this last period. So I think in many ways that explains they went from being a quarter of the country to being now 13.7% of the country is our last numbers on white evangelicals in the country. Their median age is 56, which means they're losing kind of the youngest, the next generation as well. So I think that set off this, the country is changing, and in America, it's never just been about being white, right? It's always been an ethno-religious cultural identity, and we've had a word for that, right? White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, WASP, right? That's always been the power, is that group, right? And we're here in an Episcopal church, right in the middle of that WASPy identity, right? And so I think that's the thing that we have to remember has always been defended and has always kind of set off the reactivity. The KKK, for example, right? We think of them as an anti-black organization, but why were they also anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish? Because there was a religious component to this, right? They were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant organization. That's the vision of America they were defending, and that's the division, the part of America that's actually still being defended in many ways today. So the next book, so I was kind of just trying to get the demographics right. The next book is called White Too Long, and that one really is memoir. I tell the story of those documents and my own family's story out of there. And I begin to ask a question that my family had never asked, like just to try to tie to this opening story. I knew that there had been enslavers in my family, and I got more documentation about that. The story we had never talked about, though, is like, where did that land come from? Because we knew that we went from Virginia to Georgia in the early 1800s. But it's just what we did. We migrated, right? But was never any kind of interrogation about, like, what was that about? Well, of course, that turns out to be the early Indian removal policies. We were actually on the front edge of that. It doesn't really get kicked off to the 1830s, but we were on the front edge of that. And those neat little 200-acre rectangles that families like ours they received from a land lottery. So the government forcibly removes Cherokee off the lands in Georgia, and then literally carves it up, puts people's names in a hat, draws them out, and hands it out. And so that's how we got our little plot of land down there in Georgia. So tracing that out and looking at ways that these attitudes and the embeddedness of white supremacy are still with us in public opinion today. One kind of stunning finding from that book is that the data still show today that if you take an average white American and you add Christian identity, they become more racist and not less. So I'm going to say that again. If you take your average white American and you add Christian identity, it moves them to be more racist, not less racist. So the biggest gap, the white Americans that are the closest to the views of African Americans are actually white, religiously unaffiliated Americans, not white Christians, on the issues of race. And so that was sort of like one of the big things we're wrestling with in that book. This book I'm trying to kind of go in two directions. I'm trying to trace, so how far back does this go? Right, so I did a lot, we all think about the Civil War and that being an obviously locale, but how far back does this go? And so this book, I try to kind of think back to the beginnings. How far back can we trace this entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity? How far back does it go? And so I am thinking about these, fights we're having, as I mentioned, over beginnings. Right? So we had one not that long ago over two dates. Is it 1776 or is it 1619? Right, the 1619 Project, right? Nicole Hannah-Jones wins a Pulitzer Prize, best-selling book, all of that. But part of what that was like just trying to kind of tell a different story, and those beginnings are really, really important. If you think about the biblical text, right, it opens with this assertion, in the beginning, and the very next word is God, right? So what's that about? Well, it's about a kind of an assertion of monotheism, right? So whatever follows after that, right, in the beginning, God, has to sort of deal with this assertion of a single God. Like that's the opening gambit, right? Everything else falls from there. And I think that's why we're still fighting over these stories, because you think about it. I used to collect postage stamps, and I was again kind of came of age during the bicentennial celebration. So there were all these kind of things around 1776 in those years. And I remember very specifically, there's painting of this, but it made it onto a postage stamp of 1776, and you can probably picture it. It's that one where everybody's awkwardly posed around a table and all their colonial finery with their quill pens, right? So everybody can be in the frame. And, if we say in the beginning, that image, whatever other story we tell, right, only has to account for those white guys and their knickers in Philadelphia, right? Whatever story goes forward can just begin from there. Everybody else is out of the frame. There's no women in that picture. There's no people of color in that picture. There's no indigenous people in that picture, right? And that's all we have to tell. And so I think one of the kind of reason why the 1619 Project was so big is because it not only sort of said, wait, not there, not that time, but not that place either. And I don't know if you remember the original New York Times publication offered its own image. Does anybody remember the image from the original New York Times? It was very stark. So kind of keep that image in mind. The one from the New York Times was an infinite horizon line with a black ocean over a gray sky. That's it. This like endless ocean. Very ominous looking, dark, foreboding, those kinds of things. And so it evokes the transatlantic slave trade, right? We have to kind of account, that's the story we have to start from. And so then if you begin there, you have to tell everything else. One of the things I do at the beginning of the book is I want to say a kind of yes and to that move. I think it's really important to dislodge the white guys in Philadelphia as being the only beginning point to the story. But there's a little bit of an issue with 1619, and that is that by the time we get to 1619, we have over a century of European interaction with indigenous people in this country, and they're not in the frame if we go there. So what I propose in the book is that we just kind of, take it back to 1619, that we keep expanding the lens, right? So that we're seeing a bigger timeline, we're seeing something else. And I propose that we take it back to 1493, right? Not 92 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but 93 when he goes back. And the reason why I do it there, because one of the things that's kind of overlooked is he goes back. He, of course, doesn't really know where he's been, but he knows he wants to go back and exploit the resources for wherever it is he thinks he is. But he goes back and he asks for a bunch of things. He asks for more ships, more soldiers, more missionaries and priests. But the other thing that I think gets overlooked is he asks for a moral mandate for what he's about to do. And where does he look to get the moral? He looks to the king and queen, right, to get all the other supplies. But where does he look for the moral mandate? He looks to the church for the moral mandate for what he wants to do. And at that time, this is before the Protestant Catholic split. It's before the Church of England split with the Roman Catholic Church. So this is, all of Western Europe is under the Pope in Rome. So that's where he looks. And it turns out that the popes have been busy for about the last 50 years, ever since first contact in the Americas, with issuing these kind of opinions and moral justifications for the colonial project. But in 1493, there's one that kind of caps it all off, reiterates it all, and is very specific to Columbus's voyage. And collectively, these papal bulls that got issued over the last part of the 1400s came to be called the Doctrine of Discovery. It's something that I actually think, so I'm a religion scholar, PhD in religion, and I really knew almost nothing about the Doctrine of Discovery. And I have come to see it really as almost a Rosetta Stone for understanding the entanglement of white supremacy in Christian faith. That this is where it really gets solidified, justified, inserted into an official church doctrine that then comes along for the ride for everywhere else. But give you the flavor of it, though. I mean, they are, not only saying so they basically answered the moral question with a question. And so the question was, what rights do these people have that we have so-called discovered that we are bound to respect? And the answer came back in the form of a question. Well, are they Christian? Now, of course, they knew the answer to that question, and then everything else just flowed from there. If they are not Christian, they are to be considered enemies of Christ. That was the language in the papal bull, and it went on to say that you have the right to steal their goods, to take their land, and spelled out right there in the documents from the Vatican and to submit their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? This is right there. So this is the version of Christianity that lands on these shores. And all those paintings and stuff that we see of people planting the crosses and reading a prayer, those kinds of paintings. There's one actually I point out in the Capitol Rotunda building. There's one of Hernando de Soto at the Mississippi River, the big cross. It's an 8-foot by 12-foot painting in the Capitol Rotunda. And it's part of the, founding of the story of the founding of the country. But what's in that thing is if you look at the painting, in one corner, there are wounded European soldiers with weapons, and they're pushing a cannon into the frame. Down along the bottom are just scattered all kinds of weaponry. And on the right-hand side, there is what looks to be about a 20-foot cross being erected, right? And all of that is happening inside of an indigenous village, right? So there is like a teepee in the back, and there are these kind of cowering indigenous people, and there's Hernando de Soto on his big white horse and his kind of colonial finery, looking very grand and royal, and like that's the photo. But what's happening in that cross, that planting of that cross, was actually a legal claim being made there. It wasn't just a kind of, I've always thought, well, they're having a little they're having a service of gratitude for their safe journey right over. But no, that religious ritual was actually a legal claim, laying claim to that land by the moral authority of the church and with the power of the state. So that's what's happening every time you see those crosses being erected in all of those all of those stories. So I kind of unpack the doctrine of discovery there and what it's going on here. What's remarkable to me is how this follows us, not in the abstract, but all the way through. It's in our it's lurking in our founding documents. So the Declaration of Independence, right, which we think of is the kind of holding these lofty political values. But if you read on past the kind of part that we all know at the beginning, what you see is there are a bunch of very specific grievances against the king in the latter part of the Declaration of Independence. And there's this part that reads this. And they're saying this against the king. Okay, I'll try that. Yeah. So they say this. He, the king, has excited domestic insurrections upon us. That's slave rebellions. And has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That's the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution, Section 2. Explicitly excludes Indians and counts enslaved people as 3/5, but of course not for their own purposes, but for enhancing the power of enslavers who own them, right, in the Constitution. And it enters our laws in Johnson v. McIntosh in a ruling in 1823, where Chief Justice John Marshall says this, and this is directly citing this Christian doctrine of discovery. The character and religion of the New World's inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. The potentates of the old world found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity. Now that is the basis of the title that Europeans claim land rights still today in U.S. law. It was cited as recently as 2005 in footnote 1 by none other than Ruth Bader Ginsburg in a decision against the Oneida Nation for some land that they wanted to reincorporate into their reservations. So that's kind of the story at the beginning of the book. What I didn't do is kind of look, the rest of the book is looking at very specific places because I wanted to kind of not just have it up here. So I spent some time in Missouri, in Mississippi, and in Oklahoma. And looking at how this story plays out on the ground. The truth is I could have written 50 chapters, right? So I look at the Tulsa race massacre in Tulsa, at a lynching in Duluth, Minnesota, and also that mass execution of Dakota people in Minnesota, and then Oklahoma, the Trail of Tears as well there. And try to look not only at how these tragedies have shaped the country, but what people today are doing to address them. I think that's the important part. The title of the book is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. So I am trying to look at what people are doing there to tell this story and to kind of reckon with this past at the local level. And so that's kind of a key. I can talk about that more in the discussion if we want to get out there. But I want to end with kind of one kind of reading here that I think, because I wasn't going to do this, I'm going to read it because of the ruling that happened today in Alabama. Because I think whenever we have these kind of so-called critical race theory bills, that are trying to kind of prevent us from knowing our own history. There's a lot of things they're not quite saying out loud. So at the end of the book, I tried to kind of channel as best I could what I think folks like that are really saying if they said all the quiet parts out loud, right? So here's my attempt at kind of getting at that. And I'll wrap with this, so we can see where we want to go with the discussion. All right, so this is, again, my trying to get in the heads of people who are kind of vaunting these anti-critical race theory bills and preventing us from knowing our history. We would like to hold these truths to be self-evident, that we bear no responsibility for the actions of our ancestors, nor for the effects of their actions on the present, that hard work and individual merit are the keys to understanding both the path to the present and the possibilities of the future. The haves and have-nots of today receive what they deserve based on the virtues of their individual past actions. It follows that no one, particularly hardworking white Christian people, should be made to feel uncomfortable because of what we now have. If anyone asserts otherwise, we are the ones being discriminated against. This land is our land, from California to the New York Island. We deserve to keep everything we've worked so hard to take. We have deeds and safe deposit boxes with our names on them, the veracity of which are guaranteed by a notary seal and a state we created for this purpose. As for the vast amount of wealth locked away in individual trusts and institutional endowments, we have histories that document our industriousness and our cunning, along with quarterly and annual statements that testify to our now long-held legal ownership. Furthermore, what we have done with the ultimate authority. Jesus is one of us. In case there wasn't any doubt, we made a likeness of Jesus in our image, the most widely distributed human portrait in human history. We insist, both for ourselves and for others, on an inevitable present, one in which what was leads to what is, and what is will always be. It is not that we're against history. We know the importance of a good origin story. History, done rightly, explains how we got here, with our fences transforming land into property, our ledgers turning labor and crops into capital, and our hands holding the receipts. The history of America, founded in 1776, is a Genesis story justifying the divinely ordained now, not a sloppy mess of narratives with multiple beginnings and contingent outcomes. Those who look like us own the publishing companies who hired our writers to tell us the story of how we came to be America. Those executives also had the right connections to sell those packaged narratives to our public school boards, who handed books and lesson plans to our teachers, who in turn faithfully taught these stories to our children. And the circle remains unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by. We know that slavery was a blemish on our country's record, and that this was mostly the cause of the Civil War. Still, there were good and noble people fighting on both sides. Even though slavery wasn't always as brutal as Hollywood depicts it, we're glad that sinful practice has ended and that the whole unfortunate episode is behind us now. What we didn't get right after the Civil War was finally rectified by the good Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., whose eloquent words we now read in our churches and whose birthday we celebrate alongside Robert E. Lee's. On the occasion when we think about it, we also feel bad about what happened to the Indians. But we also share Laura Ingalls Wilder's sentiments about the land in the early days of the country. Quote, "There were no people there. Only Indians lived there." End quote. In any case, we weren't personally a part of all that. And it was, after all, our missionaries who brought the Indians with their primitive and savage ways out of the darkness and into the light of Christian salvation. It was our government and our churches that coaxed those lost children out of the woods and into boarding schools, saving their souls and disciplining their bodies for more industrious pursuits, like farming and factory work. We still honor their history with our athletic team names, mascots, and more recently, with the occasional land acknowledgement ritual at public events. We did finally give the Indians reservations of their own, and they seem to be doing fine now with their casinos and government-provided health care. Finally, Though, of course, there have been some times when some Christians acted badly. They were acting against and not with the spirit of our faith. No true Christian would kill or steal or lie. This is the history we want our tax dollars to teach public school children, and many of our children are getting this history in private Christian academies. We want our children to know that America is good, just like us. So that's kind of what I tried to end the, kind of wrap my head around what I think people are really saying there. But I think it's really important, really for the future, not only of the church, and as I said, but for the future of the country, that we get this right? And it's going to take a kind of ongoing process of confession, a process of repentance, and a process of repair to kind of get us anywhere near back to a path that would look like something like we could, reasonably call a shared American future. So I will stop there. All right.
There's another mic in here. No, there's not.
Nope.
Oh, it's on the piano. Great. We've got time for a few questions. About 15 minutes. Yeah, Alice.
Do you know how many, what percentage of voters or people in America are white nationalists, Christians?
It turns out we just did a big study of this. Yeah. So about a year ago, so PRI has had a long partnership with the Brookings Institution. We've been doing a big American Values Survey every fall. We partner with E.J. Dionne and Bill Galston at Brookings. And so we did a study about a year ago trying to kind of sort out what does it mean to be, like, how can you, like, define, like, Christian nationalism, right? And what does it look like? So we basically built on there's been some really good sociological, political science research. We built on that, kind of tightened it up a little bit, and we basically came up with a set of 5 questions that define what this is. And it's things like the U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. The U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation, like those kind of statements, like 5 of them like that. It turns out if we then combine all of those statements together into one composite measure and then use that to estimate the groups, it's about 3 in 10 Americans that qualify as what we called either Christian nationalism adherents or Christian nationalism sympathizers. The adherents are about 10% of the country. So about 1 in 10 Americans completely agrees with like all of those statements. There's another 19% that mostly agree with those statements. So that means that 2/3 of the country rejects that view, right? So it's about a 2-to-1 ratio. However, so then the question is like, well, why does this seem so big, right? Why are we hearing so much about this? And the answer is that 30% is not evenly distributed across the country, right? They are, so for example, there are 2 basic groups in which a majority are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, self-identified Republicans and white evangelical Protestants. Self-identified Republicans are 55%, either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, and white evangelical Protestants are 64%, either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers.
So how can they support someone who doesn't hold Christian values?
Yeah, the Trump question. I have to say I've spent I'm not going to get these years of my life back. So much time answering this this question, but it is a head scratcher on the face of it. I tell you, the debate I heard that I think has really made a lot of sense to me and helped me make sense of it is part of it has to do with desperation. And that demographic trend that I told you about at the very beginning, right? That the country is no longer a majority white Christian country, so the sheer numbers are not there, right? To just say, we're going to turn out people and we're just going to outvote people, right? The numbers aren't there anymore. And so I think this shift in culture, the shift in demographics has set off a kind of desperation moment for many conservative white Christians. And then I think the other, piece of this is simply that in that kind of atmosphere, in a kind of apocalyptic, everything's at stake, it's good versus evil, like that's the way it gets constructed, the morality question kind of falls to the side, right? Because it really is about an end that you have to protect. And if you believe that that is the end that God wants, then the means kind of start to become less important, right? You don't have to have virtuous means if you have a holy end. And I think that's part of what's going on. And so why you don't really see, I mean, every now and then you see these kind of weird portraits of Trump with Jesus hugging him or something like that, right? But the main, more serious arguments you hear are not Trump as Jesus, but Trump as King Cyrus. All right, so who's King Cyrus out of the Hebrew Bible? He is an ungodly king who nonetheless frees the Israelites, right? And so that kind of figure, God's using this ungodly figure for our good, is the way the logic then goes. And Robert Jeffries, who's the pastor at First Baptist Church in Dallas, a big, this church has had like Make America Great Again Sunday. They had a commissioned choral piece that was literally titled Make America Great Again. You can Google it and watch it. And they did it like in July 4th, a big God and Country Day kind of celebration. They've had Trump to speak several times in that sanctuary. But he was on NPR back in 2016. I remember it very distinctly. And they were asking him this question, like, during the Clinton years, you were all about like moral values and all that, values voters and all that stuff. What's up? And he just said, look, the country's in such a terrible place, and that I want the meanest son of a you-know-what I can find in the White House, and that's Donald Trump. And this is from the senior pastor at First Baptist Church in Dallas, who's like very high up Southern Baptist, official, which is the largest evangelical denomination. And that attitude, I think, has essentially won the day. We can even see it in the public opinion data, not just among elite leaders who have made this kind of utilitarian calculus. We asked a question in 2011, before Trump enters the scene, about whether and the question was, do you agree or disagree that a leader who commits an immoral act in their private life can still fulfill their duties in their public life? So when we asked that question in 2011, white evangelicals, only 30% of white evangelicals agreed with that statement. Now, that's what you'd expect, right? If somebody says, we're values voters, right? No, you've got to have a good moral character to fill your... We asked that question again in 2016 with Trump at the top of the ticket. 72% agreed with that statement, right? And so it's just been this, essentially a kind of devolution of political ethics or a kind of wholesale exchange of an ethics of principle for an ethics of kind of utility. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I take your point about the tie of a Christian identity to making a person statistically more racist, more intolerant. I'm sure you're aware of Taking Back America for God, another really excellent book on Christian nationalism. One of the points that book makes, which I think is important and a key towards kind of figuring out how to deal with folks who think like this, they actually find that statistically speaking, the more you go to church and the more you actually know the Bible, the less racist you are and the more tolerant you are. And so I think it's important to distinguish between just a Christian identity and people who actually go to church and actually understand the Bible in terms of dealing with folks and trying to maybe appeal to them and saying, hey, you're just not living up to your... It's not that you're Christian, it's that you're not Christian is making you the way you are.
Yeah, so I know Sam Perry and Andrew Whitehead pretty well. I'll have to check the book. I'm not sure that's what it finds. And I can certainly say this, that in all of the PRI data that we've collected, we find exactly the opposite. Right? That what we find is actually that I've written I wrote a piece about a month ago called because I was trying to kind of get this out there, the zombie myth of white evangelical support for Trump. And what I meant by that is this myth that, or this idea that the real supporters of Trump are the people who don't go to church, right? The real supporters of anti-immigrant sentiment are the people who don't go to church. The real supporters of anti-black sentiment are the people who don't go to church. But it's not really what the vast preponderance of data show. And what's disturbing, and I say this as somebody who, I care very deeply about the church. I'm Christian. I care very deeply about all of that. And it is, I remember very distinctly when I was looking at that data in the last book, the data kind of establishing that's in White Too Long, but I remember having to push my chair back from the desk. Like I was just done for the day when I saw that data and just thought, oh, right, actually, and particularly among white evangelicals, it's the church-growing group that is kind of on that glide path, that the more you go to church, the more racist attitudes that you actually hold. And what it tells us, we shouldn't be that surprised, I think, in many ways by that thing, right? So if you take seriously, so the denomination I grew up in, founded in 1845. So what's going on in 1845 is the precursor to the Civil War, right? And what we often don't realize from the history is that the political secession that gives us the Civil War, there was a dress rehearsal for that in white Christian churches in 1845. Right, so it's the Christian churches that secede from each other before the states secede from each other. Right, so 1845, both the Methodists and the Baptists, the largest Protestant denominations at the time, both split, North and South, over the issue of slavery. Right, in fact, the Southern Baptist Convention, I grew up then, and I always thought the word Southern was just a geographic, we're here and those other Baptists are up there, right? I didn't really kind of equate it with a kind of Confederate imagery, but it was exactly that, right? There's no other way to say it than like, in fact, the opening sentence of White Too Long is something like this: the denomination in which I grew up was dedicated to the proposition that enslaving others on the basis of the color of their skin was compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And if we think about that too, that denomination is still today the largest expression of white Christianity in the country. Still today is that and every other denomination, like the Episcopal Church, right, splits, North and South, the Presbyterians split, every Protestant denomination splits ultimately. Now, most mend the rift by the early 20th century. The Methodists get back together, the Episcopalians get back together. The Baptists never get back together. That's why we still have the Southern Baptists and the American Baptists up there. So if we take all that history really seriously, it was in the churches that white supremacy was espoused, protected, nurtured, and given its ultimate justification, right, as the will of God. Like there's no other higher justification than that, right, to kind of claim a kind of social policy and vision for the country. And as hard as that is to hear, and I still flinch a little bit when I say it that way, even though I've been talking about this for 10 years now. But I think there's no other way that we just have to look in the mirror. And I think we have to hold the gaze. That's one thing that phrase I hold on to a lot, because I often just want to look away, because it's really hard to stare at it, right? For something that gave me so much, right? Something I have very warm feelings about. I wouldn't be who I am without that church. And yet, these other things are true too. Yeah.
Got time for just one more question. Make it good, Barbara.
I am so grateful for your measurement of attitudes and what you have taught us and learned. Has it taught you anything about changing these attitudes? You talk about a shared path for the future. We're in a 5-alarm fire right now until November. And I think it continues with regard to Christianity after November. What can we do, and do you address that in your book?
Yeah, I do. So I gave an example, like in the last book, of two churches in Macon, Georgia. Turns out there's two First Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia. One's predominantly white, one's predominantly black. And it turns out they used to be the same church, right, in 1820. And so you can guess the history there. But they've basically been like separated, and they managed to sort of basically got new pastors at the early 2000s, and finally decided like they're still around the corner from each other, right? And just completely ignored each other for 150 years, and decided we should be in relationship with one another. They weren't about to merge the church or any of that. But the thing I say that to say, what I've seen to make a difference, the examples that I give in Minnesota, in Oklahoma, and that last book in Georgia, and in Mississippi, what really made a difference is relationships and proximity. And that's why I think talking in a community like this is like really important. The fact that like in Mississippi, and I was in Tallahatchie County, which is where Emmett Till was killed, right? And there was a group of people that just said, so like in 2000, around the world, people know the name Emmett Till, right? And they know that as kind of part of the civil rights story. But as late as 2000, if you'd gone to Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, where it happened, there was absolutely nothing. No public markers, nothing, right? The courthouse was just a dilapidated courthouse. There was like nothing telling that story at all. And so it was a group of citizens that decided, like, we need to tell the truth about what happened here, and we need to do it publicly, and we need to offer an apology to the Till family. That's how it kind of got off the ground. And for the last 20 years, they've been like working together, but it took this group sitting in the courthouse basement, descendants of sharecroppers and descendants of enslavers, who all know each other's history. The county seat town has 632 people in it, right? So this is not a big place. But it took them hanging in there in a room and in close proximity together to kind of get some traction. So what I'd say is, like, here, like, the importance of partnerships and a commitment to be in relationship. I mean, I'm looking around the room, predominantly white room, but the commitment to be in relationship, and like, I'm all for like doing our own work. Like, white people need to have conversations with white people about this. There's no doubt about that, but also needing to be in equitable relationships with other people, because I think it's that relationship that changes your vision of like what it is, what you show up for. It even changes what you think is important to show up for, what's important to speak out on. All of that stuff shifts. So I really think it is that kind of proximity and relationship to one another, and it's a long game, right? It's not a short thing. I think that's the thing. Like, those churches in Macon have been working together now for 20 years. And it took potlucks, Easter egg rolls for the kids, shared youth trips, like those kinds of things to begin to build those bonds together that I think then started to make a real difference. So.
Just before we end, I thought, you mentioned the case that happened in Alabama today. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening at whitetolong.org, your Substack? Just what kind of content, especially, the next couple of months, there's quite a bit going on in the news and of the election, and a bunch of people who I bet would be interested.
Thank you for that excuse to plug my newsletter. I write externally at Time and other places, but what I found is that I wanted to have a space where I could write about these things that just come up, like the ruling this week. I just wrote a piece last week about a very important speech that it got coverage but not attention. It's interesting. It got reported on, but it just didn't create the kind of buzz that it should have. It was a speech that Trump gave to the National Religious Broadcasters Association in Nashville, Tennessee on February 22nd. And in that speech, he essentially lays out his white Christian nationalist vision for the country. I mean, it is explicit. It is like chilling, but it just didn't like register. So I kind of wrote a piece kind of analyzing that and kind of trying to kind of push it up there. So for those of you not familiar with Substack, it's essentially just a newsletter. You don't even have to know that it's Substack. It's a newsletter platform. Most of the content on there is free. I have a few things like that are author interviews that for new books, like I did one with Jim Wallace a couple of weeks ago, that are only for paid subscribers, but for the most part, all the content's free, and I'm just trying to kind of hold these issues up. So as we have new studies coming out, I'm putting the quantitative stuff up there. As we have new things like that Trump speech up, that is important to help us to kind of decode what's going on there. So it's www.whitetolong.net. Is where it is, and it's free to sign up for. Thank you. Yep.
Thanks, Dr. Jones. And just before we clap, you mentioned Jim Wallace. Next week, my understanding is that you will be at his book launch at the panel at Georgetown.
I should plug that. No, that's right. It is next Tuesday. I think it's next Tuesday night.
Oh, yeah.
I'm moderating a book launch for, maybe Reverend Jim Wallace. He's got a new book called The False White Gospel. It is really good. I wrote an endorsement for it. But I'm going to be moderating the event. It's going to be Jim Wallace, Eddie Glaude Jr., and Vashti McKenzie. who's the president of the National Council of Churches. Eddie Glaude's a professor of religion at Princeton, but a New York Times bestselling author, wrote a fabulous book called Begin Again about James Baldwin. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend that book. And so it should be a really fantastic conversation. Yeah.
Jim was here at church last Sunday and mentioned this, and his assistant sent me invitations. So if anyone is interested in one of those, I can pass those along. Let's warmly thank Dr. Jones. If you'd like to say hello and get his book and get a book signature, I'm going to whisk him away to the back where Megan from People's Books has joined us here. So.